The metallic click of 15 safeties being switched off simultaneously should have been the only sound in the nursery. As the head of the Kong Syndicate, Kong Min-jae was a man who lived and breathed the language of weapons. But as he kicked open the mahogany doors of his daughter's suite, the scene before him didn't just stop his heart, it froze his entire security detail in their tracks. On the floor lay 3 of the world's most elite mercenaries, neutralized with a surgical precision that shouldn't be possible. And standing over his trembling 8-year-old daughter, Seo-yun, wasn't a soldier or a rival hitman. It was Aisha Okoye, the soft-spoken maid he'd hired only 3 weeks ago to fold laundry and pour tea at Never. Min-jae stepped over a fallen blade, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the room. He had expected to find his daughter kidnapped, the room a vacuum of silence and grief. Instead, he found the air still vibrating with the aftermath of a forbidden style of combat moves meant to kill, executed with the grace of a ritual. Aisha stood in the center of the wreckage, her simple black and white uniform slightly torn at the shoulder, revealing the faint, silver glint of scars on her collarbone that spoke of a life far darker than domestic service. Her posture was no longer that of a servant. She was a coiled spring, her eyes alert and unreadable as she shielded Seo-yun behind her. Park Dae-sung, the broad-shouldered head guard, leveled his weapon at Aisha, his knuckles white with shock. He didn't recognize the technique she had used, but he recognized the lethality of it. For a moment, the room was a standoff of heavy breathing and pointed barrels. Min-jae looked from the fallen assassins to the calm, disciplined woman holding his daughter's hand. His entire empire was built on the absolute control of violence, yet here, in his own home, a hidden warrior had done what his million-dollar security team could not. As Seo-yun reached out to clutch Aisha's apron, the icy walls around Min-jae's heart didn't just crack, they shattered. He felt a terrifying loss of control, and for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like salvation. The iron gates of the Kong estate groaned with a weight that felt more like a warning than a welcome. As Aisha Okoye stepped out of the transport car, she adjusted the modest strap of her bag, her eyes subtly scanning the perimeter. To any casual observer, she was merely a young woman looking for a fresh start, her dark skin glowing softly under the California sun. But beneath the unassuming facade of her simple traveling clothes, every muscle was primed. The mansion loomed ahead, a fortress of glass and cold stone that seemed to mirror the reputation of its master. At the entrance stood Park Dae-sung. He was a mountain of a man in a tactical suit, his military cropped hair and scarred knuckles telling a story of a life lived in the trenches of the underworld. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, his gaze lingered on Aisha's hands, then her posture, with a predatory suspicion that made her pulse quicken. He was looking for a threat, but Aisha had spent years learning how to look like nothing at all. "Keep your head down and follow the rules," Dae-sung barked, his voice like gravel. "The boss doesn't like noise. And he doesn't like mistakes." He led her through echoing hallways to a study that smelled of expensive leather and old secrets. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window was Hong Kong Min-jae. Even with his back turned, his presence dominated the room, a silent authority that made the air feel thin. When he turned, Aisha met a pair of eyes so cold they felt like a physical weight. A faint scar ran along his sharp jawline, a jagged reminder of the violence he commanded. Min-jae didn't speak at first. He simply watched her, his calculating mind dissecting her presence. Aisha dropped her gaze respectfully, a perfect mask of quiet humility, though she could feel his intense scrutiny. "You are here to care for my daughter, not to be seen," Min-jae said, his voice a calm, dangerous silk. "She is the only thing in this house that matters. Remember that." Aisha nodded, her voice steady. "I understand, Mr. Han." As she was dismissed, she felt their eyes on her back, Dae-sung's suspicious and Min-jae's intrigued. She had entered the lion's den, and the silence of the house told her that the shadows here were deeper than she had imagined. The heavy, mahogany door to the nursery creaked open, revealing a world that felt miles away from the cold steel and sharp whispers of the rest of the mansion. Here, the air was scented with lavender and vanilla, a soft contrast to the sterile authority Aisha had just left behind in the study. In the center of the room, seated on a plush rug surrounded by half-finished drawings, was Kong Seo-yun. The young girl was dressed in a pale lavender dress, her soft features illuminated by the afternoon sun. When she looked up, Her big, expressive eyes didn't hold the suspicion of the guards or the calculation of her father. Instead, they were filled with a quiet, observant loneliness that tugged at a part of Aisha's heart she usually kept locked away. "You're the new one," Seo-yun whispered, her voice like the chime of a silver bell. Aisha softened her posture immediately, the lethal tension in her shoulders melting into a warm, inviting grace. She knelt on the rug, making herself level with the child, a gesture of equality that was rare in this house of hierarchy. "I am Aisha," she said softly. "I'm here to help you, Seo-yun." The girl hesitated, then pushed a stray pastel crayon toward Aisha. "Do you know how to draw a crane? My mother used to say they were symbols of protection." Aisha took the crayon, her fingers moving with a steadiness that was both artistic and disciplined. As she sketched the elegant bird, she noticed the way Seo-yun's small hand hovered near her own, seeking warmth. The child was the emotional heart of this fortress, a delicate flower growing in the cracks of a concrete empire. In that moment, as Seo-yun leaned her head against Aisha's shoulder, a fierce, protective instinct flared in Aisha's chest. She had come here to hide from her past, but looking at the innocent girl clinging to her apron, she realized she had found something worth fighting for. Aisha wasn't just here to clean rooms or serve tea, she was here to be the shield this child didn't even know she needed. The bond was instantaneous, a silent pact between a girl who needed a friend and a warrior who had found a reason to stay. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the grand foyer, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floors. Aisha worked in silence, her movements rhythmic and efficient as she polished the intricate woodwork of the grand staircase. She had traded her traveling clothes for the crisp black and white maid's uniform, a garment that served as her armor of invisibility. In this house, being unnoticed was her greatest advantage. As she reached upward to dust a high crystal sconce, the lace cuff of her sleeve slid back, exposing the underside of her wrist. There, etched into the dark, smooth skin, was a series of jagged, silvered-lined scars that no kitchen accident could explain. They were the marks of restraints, the remnants of a life where she had been a weapon forged in the dark, held captive by those who feared the very power they had created. She didn't hear the footsteps. In the Kong mansion, danger usually announced itself with a heavy tread, but Han Kong Min-jae moved like a predator, silent and absolute. He was standing at the base of the stairs, a glass of water in his hand, his gaze fixed upward. Aisha caught his reflection in the polished wood and froze. She slowly lowered her arm, the lace falling back into place to hide her history, but the damage was done. Min-jae's eyes, usually as cold as a winter sea, narrowed. He had seen them. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. He knew the anatomy of violence. He recognized the difference between a victim's scars and those of a survivor who had fought her way out of hell. "You move with a discipline that wasn't learned in a housekeeping school, Aisha," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Aisha didn't flinch. She kept her eyes downcast, the model of a perfect servant. "Hard work leaves many marks, Mr. Han. Some are just more visible than others." Min-jae took a slow sip of his water, his intensity never wavering. He didn't push further, but as he turned to walk away, the air remained charged. He had hired a ghost to clean his house, only to realize she carried the weight of 1,000 battles in her stride. For Aisha, the lace was back in place, but the secret was out. The maid was a warrior in hiding. The moon was swallowed by heavy clouds, plunging the Kong estate into a predatory darkness. Inside the mansion, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum. Aisha sat in the armchair beside Seo-yun's bed, her eyes wide and adjusted to the gloom. She didn't need a security monitor to know the perimeter had been breached. She felt it in the subtle shift of the air currents and the sudden, unnatural absence of the crickets outside. A faint, metallic snick echoed from the hallway, the sound of a glass cutter against a window. Aisha rose in one fluid motion, her movements devoid of the clumsy friction of a maid. She didn't reach for a panic button. She knew the wires had likely been clipped. Instead, she moved to the bed and placed a firm, grounding hand over Seo-yun's mouth just as the young girl began to stir. "Stay under the bed, little crane," Aisha whispered, her voice a calm, hypnotic thread. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. It's just a game of hide and seek." Seo-yun's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded, sliding into the narrow crawlspace beneath the heavy oak frame. Aisha stood and adjusted her uniform, her fingers tracing the scars on her wrists one last time before tucking them beneath her lace cuffs. The door to the wing creaked. Two shadows slipped inside, the matte black of their tactical gear absorbing the dim light. They moved with the synchronized grace of professional hitmen, suppressed submachine guns leveled at the bed. They didn't see the maid standing in the corner shadows until she moved. Aisha didn't strike like a brawler, she moved like a shadow coming to life. Before the first assassin could pivot his weapon, she was within his guard. A palm strike to the chin snapped his head back, followed by a sweeping kick that shattered the second man's knee. The forbidden nature of her training was evident in the silence of the takedown, no wasted energy, no unnecessary noise. In the distance, the muffled sounds of gunfire broke out in the main house, signaling that the rest of the security team was occupied. Aisha stood alone in the hallway, a silk and iron barrier between the world's monsters and the innocent heart of the house. The maid was gone, only the warrior remained. The secondary wave of attackers never made it past the threshold. Inside the nursery suite, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and copper, but the silence had returned sharp and jagged. Aisha stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence that betrayed no exhaustion. At her feet lay the three professional hitters, neutralized not with the messy spray of gunfire, but with the terrifying economy of a master. One was sprawled awkwardly, his breathing shallow from a crushed windpipe. Another's arm was twisted at an impossible angle, his weapon discarded like a toy. The heavy double doors at the end of the hall burst open with a violent crash. Park Dae-sung charged in first, his tactical rifle raised, followed closely by Kang Min-jae. The guards fanned out, their eyes darting through the shadows, fingers twitching on triggers. They expected to find a bloodbath or an empty room. Instead, they froze. The sight was a physical blow to their reality. Aisha was positioned protectively in front of the bed, her maid's apron slightly rumpled but her gaze as steady as an executioner's. Her hands were open, her fingers curved into the claws of a style Dae-sung had only heard of in whispers, a forbidden shadow technique used by ghosts, not housekeepers. "Lower your weapons," Min-jae commanded, his voice a low tremor. He stepped past his stunned guards, his eyes raking over the fallen mercenaries. He recognized the symbols on their gear. These were high-level ghosts of the underworld, men his own security team had struggled to contain in the foyer. And yet, here they were, dismantled by a woman whose only job was to ensure his tea was hot. Dae-sung didn't lower his gun. His face was a mask of wounded pride and utter disbelief. "How?" he rasped, looking at the tiny, lethal woman. "Who are you?" Aisha didn't answer. She didn't move until she felt the slight tug on her skirt. Seoyun crawled out from beneath the bed, her small face tear-streaked but safe. As the child threw her arms around Aisha's waist, the warrior's lethal stance vanished, replaced instantly by the soft, nurturing presence of the maid. "It's okay, little crane," Aisha whispered, ignoring the 15 gun barrels still pointed at her heart. "The game is over." Min-jae watched them, his jaw tight. He looked at the scars peeking from her lace cuffs and finally understood. He hadn't just hired a maid, he had invited a storm into his home, and it was the only thing that had kept his world from burning down. The aftermath of the attack hung heavy in the air, but the silence of Kang Min-jae's private study was far more suffocating than the chaos in the halls. Aisha sat in the low velvet chair opposite his desk, her posture back to the prim, composed stillness of a maid. Yet the illusion was shattered. Min-jae leaned forward, the light from the desk lamp casting the scar on his jaw into sharp relief. Across the room, Park Dae-sung stood by the door like a gargoyle, his hand never straying far from his holstered weapon. "Those men were not common thugs," Min-jae began, his voice a low, dangerous silk that vibrated in the small space. "They were specialists from the Obsidian Group. Men trained to be invisible, to leave no trace. And yet, you dismantled them in less than 3 minutes without breaking a sweat." He tossed a heavy, black combat knife onto the desk between them, one of the weapons Aisha had disarmed. "That is a forbidden style, Aisha. A technique taught only in the shadow camps of the West African coast, meant for high-value extraction and total neutralization. My guards have spent decades in the military and the syndicate, and even they don't know the counters to what you did tonight." Aisha didn't flinch. She kept her eyes focused on the edge of the desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I learned what I had to in order to survive, Mr. Han. The world is not kind to those who cannot defend themselves. Survival is one thing, Min-jae countered, standing up to pace the length of the room. He stopped directly behind her, his presence a towering weight. Precision like yours is an art form. Who trained you? Who are you running from that you would hide in my house, scrubbing floors while carrying the skills of a ghost? Aisha finally looked up, her unreadable eyes meeting his cold, calculating gaze. For the first time, she allowed a sliver of the warrior's steel to show through. The people who trained me are dead, Mr. Han. And as long as I am in this house, your daughter is safe. Isn't that what you pay me for? Min-jae stared at her, the tension in the room reaching a breaking point. He saw the scars on her wrists and the unwavering fire in her eyes. He knew he should cast her out, but he also knew that he had just found the only shield in the world strong enough to protect his heart. The tension of the interrogation began to settle into a strange, silent understanding between the master of the house and the maid. While Min-jae watched from the shadows of the upper balcony, his eyes following Aisha with a new, searing intensity, the daily life of the mansion resumed a deceptive normalcy. But in the sun-drenched playroom, the nature of their interaction had shifted. Aisha moved the heavy rugs to the edges of the room, creating a wide, open space. Seo-yoon stood in the center, her big eyes bright with a mix of curiosity and lingering fear from the night of the attack. We are going to learn a special dance, Seo-yoon, Aisha said, her voice a soothing melody that masked the tactical intent behind her words. It's the dance of the wind. The wind is soft, but it can never be caught. It moves around obstacles and stays free. Aisha began with a slow, rhythmic sway, her feet sliding across the polished wood in a sequence of precise footwork that looked like ballet but was rooted in the evasive maneuvers of her shadow training. Step, pivot, and breathe, she coached softly. Seo-yoon mirrored her, her small pastel skirts fluttering as she tried to mimic Aisha's fluid grace. What looked like a child's game was, in reality, the foundation of a lethal defense. The pirouettes were spins designed to break a collarbone grip. The reaching for the stars was a strike aimed at a predator's pressure points. Again, Aisha encouraged, her eyes alert to the girl's center of gravity. If someone tries to grab you, you don't fight their strength. You become like the air. The implications aren't there. Seo-yoon laughed, a sound so rare it seemed to vibrate through the cold walls of the fortress. She felt powerful, her small body gaining a confidence that had been stripped away by her father's violent world. From his vantage point, Min-jae felt his chest tighten. He saw the way Aisha moved the hidden lethality disguised as a gift for his daughter. She was giving Seo-yoon the one thing his guns and guards never could, the ability to walk through the world without flinching. He realized then that Aisha wasn't just teaching his daughter how to dance, she was teaching her how to survive the crown she was born to inherit. The training room in the basement of the Kang mansion smelled of sweat, heavy leather, and the bitter tang of wounded pride. Park Dae-sung hammered his fists against the heavy punching bag, the dull thuds echoing like gunfire against the concrete walls. His knuckles were raw, but the physical sting was nothing compared to the phantom image that haunted him. A maid in a black and white uniform standing effortlessly over professional killers his own men had failed to stop. For 20 years, Dae-sung had been the iron wall between the world and the Kang family. He had survived street wars in Seoul and back-alley betrayals in Los Angeles, earning his position through blood and unyielding discipline. To be outshone was one thing. To be made obsolete by a woman who spent her mornings dusting bookshelves was a humiliation that burned in his gut like acid. He stopped his assault on the bag, his chest heaving, and looked up to see his own reflection in the wall of mirrors. He looked at his scarred hands, then at the earpiece resting on the bench, the symbol of his authority. In his mind, he replayed Aisha's movements. They weren't the moves of a brawler or a soldier. They were the moves of a ghost. The forbidden precision she had displayed suggested a pedigree of violence that made his military training look like child's play. A shadow moved in the doorway. He didn't have to look to know it was Min-jae. The boss had been spending more time in the security wings lately, his silence more judgmental than any verbal reprimand. She is a variable we didn't account for, Dae-sung, Min-jae said, his voice echoing in the gym. She is a security risk, Dae-sung snapped, his voice tight with suppressed rage. We don't know who she is or who is following her. My men are shaken. They see a maid doing their job better than they can. Min-jae stepped into the light, his cold eyes fixed on his head guard. Perhaps they should be shaken. It reminds them that complacency is the first step toward the grave. Dae-sung gripped his hand wraps so tightly his fingers turned white. He wasn't just losing his standing, he was losing his purpose. As he watched Min-jae walk away, Dae-sung realized that his loyalty was no longer just about protection. It was about proving that he still belonged in the shadow of the throne, even if he had to tear down the silent guardian to do it. The digital flickering of the security monitors in a high-rise office halfway across the city cast a cold, blue glow over a face hidden in shadows. A man leaned forward, his eyes narrowed as he replayed the footage from the Kong mansion breach for the 20th time. The frame was grainy, the lighting poor, but the way the maid moved, that specific, lethal fluidity was unmistakable. He paused the video at the exact moment Aisha executed a twisting wrist lock, her lace cuff pulling back to reveal the silvered scars. He zoomed in until the pixelated lines of her skin filled the screen. "Found you," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of a decade-long hunt. To the world, Aisha Okoye was a ghost, a weapon that had supposedly been broken and discarded years ago when the obsidian camps were razed. But those specific, forbidden moves were a signature. They were the dialect of a very particular school of death, one he had helped oversee. He recognized the way she didn't just strike, but intercepted the opponent's kinetic energy. It was a style known as the Eclipse Blade, and there was only one student who had ever truly mastered the silent transition from stillness to total neutralization. He picked up a sleek, encrypted phone and dialed a number that didn't exist on any public register. "The asset is alive," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "She's working as a domestic in the Hollywood Hills. She's protecting the Kong family's daughter." There was a pause on the other end, a silence filled with the realization that the most dangerous weapon they had ever forged was currently playing house with a Korean mafia boss. "Do not engage yet," the voice on the line commanded. "The Kong syndicate is a hornet's nest. We wait until she is isolated. If she has found something worth protecting, she has finally found a weakness we can exploit." The man in the shadows closed the laptop, the screen going black, but the image of Aisha's alert, unreadable eyes remained burned into his mind. The past wasn't just catching up to Aisha, it was closing in with the cold, calculated intent of a predator who had finally picked up a scent. The air in the grand dining hall was thick with the scent of charcoal-grilled galbi and the cold, metallic tang of suppressed hostility. Hong Kong Min-jae sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his expression a mask of granite. Opposite him sat Chairman Ko, a man whose grandfatherly smile hid a reputation for feeding his enemies to the Pacific. This was a dinner of reconciliation, but the dozen armed men lining the walls suggested otherwise. Aisha moved through the room like a ghost in silk. Dressed in her formal maid's uniform, she moved with a tray of vintage wine, her eyes downcast and her steps silent. To the guests, she was part of the furniture, an invisible servant of the Kong household. But beneath her calm exterior, Aisha's mind was a tactical computer, running at 1,000 cycles per second. She didn't just see the men, she saw the slight bulge of a concealed holster under a blazer, the nervous twitch in a guard's peripheral vision, and the way Ko's personal assistant kept his hand hovering near his waist. Every time she leaned in to refill a glass, she was measuring distances, the 4 seconds it would take to reach Min-jae, the 3 steps to the nearest exit, the weight of the heavy silver carafe that could serve as a lethal bludgeon in an instant. Min-jae caught her eye for a fleeting second as she poured his wine. There was no command in his gaze, only a dark, simmering recognition. He knew that while his own guards were watching the doors, the woman standing at his shoulder was watching the souls of every man in the room. "Your staff is remarkably disciplined, Kong," Ko remarked, his eyes lingering on Aisha with a predatory curiosity. "She has the stillness of a statue." "She knows her place," Min-jae replied smoothly, though his hand tightened slightly around his glass. Aisha felt the shift in the room before it happened, a subtle tightening of Ko's shoulders. A silent signal passed between his men. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, her hand tightening on the serving tray. The dinner was a theater, and the curtain was about to rise on a bloodbath. She was no longer just a maid, she was the silent reaper waiting in the light, ready to turn a dinner with the devil into his final meal. The silence of the mansion at 3 in the morning was a different kind of heavy, less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. Kang Min-jae stood in the doorway of the darkened kitchen, watching Aisha. She wasn't scrubbing floors or serving tea. She was sitting at the small wooden table, meticulously cleaning a disassembled handgun she had confiscated from one of KO's men earlier that evening. Her movements were a rhythmic, hypnotic dance of steel and oil. The moonlight caught the silver scars on her wrists, and for the first time, Min-jae didn't see them as wounds. He saw them as the history of a woman who had survived the impossible. She looked up, her alert eyes meeting his, and she didn't move to hide the weapon. The mask of the maid had finally slipped, leaving only the truth of the warrior beneath. "You should be sleeping, Mr. Han," she said, her voice a low, steady vibration that seemed to anchor the restless energy in his chest. Min-jae stepped into the room, the distance between them shrinking until he could smell the faint scent of lavender and gun oil. "I've spent my life surrounded by men who are paid to die for me," he said, his voice unusually raw. "But none of them have ever looked at my daughter the way you do. None of them have taught her that she is more than just a target." He looked at her hands capable of crushing a throat or comforting a crying child with equal ease. He realized then that his fascination had turned into something far more dangerous than professional curiosity. He wasn't just impressed by her lethality, he was drawn to the quiet fire of her soul. She was the only person in his world who didn't fear him, and perhaps the only one who truly understood the weight of the crown he wore. As Aisha stood to set the weapon aside, their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own loneliness, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the city realized he was utterly defenseless. He was falling for the woman who was more dangerous than his entire security detail combined, and for the first time, he didn't want to fight the surrender. The fragile peace of the mansion was shattered not by a sound, but by a chilling, hollow silence that radiated from the garden. Aisha had only stepped away for a moment to retrieve a tray of tea, but when she returned to the stone patio where Seo Yun had been practicing her wind dance, the space was empty. A single lavender hair ribbon lay discarded on the grass, and the scent of ozone and van exhaust lingered in the stagnant air. Min-jae's reaction was instantaneous, a roar of controlled fury that sent his guards scrambling. But before the security monitors could even be reviewed, his encrypted phone vibrated with a video message. The screen flickered to life, showing Seo Yun tied to a chair in a dimly lit warehouse, her big eyes wide with a terror that clawed at Min-jae's soul. Standing behind her was Chairman KO's son, his face twisted in a sneer. "You grew soft, Kang," the voice hissed through the speaker. "Hiring women and children to play games in your garden. We took the weak link. If you want the girl back, you surrender your ports and your pride by dawn, or she becomes a ghost." Min-jae's hand shook with a rare, visceral tremors, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. He turned to bark an order to Dae-sung, but stopped when he saw Aisha. She was standing by the garden gate, her black and white uniform perfectly crisp, but her aura had shifted into something terrifyingly cold. She wasn't weeping or panicking. She was staring at the tire tracks in the gravel with a predatory focus that made even the armed guards take a step back. The weak link they thought they had exploited was, in reality, the most lethal mistake the Ko Syndicate would ever make. "They don't know who I am," Aisha said, her voice a low, hollow vibration that chilled the air. "They think they took a child from a maid. They didn't realize they invited an eclipse into their house." She looked at Min-jae, and for the first time, there was no master and servant. There were only two hunters with a single purpose. "Get the cars," she commanded. "I'm going to show them exactly how forbidden my moves can be." The warehouse on the edge of the harbor was a tomb of rusted iron and salt-cracked concrete, but to Aisha, it was a familiar geometry of tactical entries and blind corners. Beside her, Kang Min-jae moved with the heavy, blunt force of a storm, his customized handgun an extension of his lethal intent. They didn't speak. The air between them was charged with a silent, intuitive frequency. They were no longer boss and servant, but two apex predators synchronized by a single, desperate heartbeat. When the heavy steel doors were breached, the Ko Syndicate guards expected a frontal assault from a desperate father. They didn't expect the shadow that moved faster than the eye could track. Aisha was a blur of black and white, her maid's uniform a mocking contrast to the carnage she unleashed. She moved with the eclipse blade style, using the momentum of the first guard's draw to snap his wrist before spinning into a high lateral kick that sent a second man through a wooden crate. Min-jae provided the thunder to her lightning. While Aisha dismantled the front line with her forbidden precision, Min-jae covered her flank, his shots surgical and rhythmic. Every time a guard tried to gain a line of sight on her, Min-jae was already there, neutralizing the threat before it could materialize. It was a perfect combat synergy, the brute authority of the Mafia king and the silent lethality of the ghost warrior. As they reached the center of the warehouse, Chairman Ko's son stood trembling, his gun pressed to Seo Yun's temple. "Stay back. I'll do it," he screamed, his voice cracking under the pressure of the two-person army approaching him. Min-jae stopped, his face a mask of cold stone, his weapon leveled with terrifying steadiness. But it was Aisha who spoke, her voice a low, melodic whisper that carried through the cavernous space. "You think holding that gun makes you the predator," she said, her eyes glowing with an ancient, lethal fire. "But you've already been caught in the wind." In a movement that defied the physics of the room, Aisha launched a heavy iron bolt she had palmed from the floor. It struck the man's hand with the force of a bullet just as Min-jae lunged forward. In the heartbeat between his scream and the sound of his weapon hitting the floor, Seo Yun was safe, tucked firmly against Aisha's chest while Min-jae stood over the fallen rival, the rescue complete. The warehouse was silent once more, but the air remained heavy with the realization that their lives could never return to the fractured piece of the mansion. As the smoke cleared, Min-jae watched Aisha kneel beside Seo Yun, checking the girl for injuries with a tenderness that defied the blood on her knuckles. He saw the way his daughter clung to the maid, seeking the warmth of a woman who had become her shield, and he finally understood the cost of his crown. His empire was built on iron and intimidation, but it had nearly cost him the only heart that beat for him. Standing amidst the wreckage of his rivals, Min-jae looked at his hands that had directed 1,000 wars. He realized that as long as he sat on the throne of the Kong Syndicate, he was painting a target on the backs of those he loved. Later that night, back in the quiet safety of his study, Min-jae summoned Park Daesung. The head guard entered, his face bruised and his spirit humbled by the display of skill he had witnessed from this simple housekeeper. "Dismantle it," Min-jae said, his voice a low, steady command that brooked no argument. "The ports, the protection rackets, the hierarchy. Sell the assets and launder the funds into legitimate holdings. By the end of the month, the Kong name will be associated with logistics and tech, not blood." Daesung gasped, his eyes widening in shock. "Sir, you're walking away from decades of power. You'll be vulnerable. Without the organization, we're just targets." "No," Min-jae replied, his gaze drifting toward the hallway where Aisha was leading Seo Yun to bed. "With the organization, we are targets. Without it, we have a chance to be a family." Aisha appeared in the doorway, her uniform replaced by a simple sweater, the warrior's fire dimmed into a soft, appreciative glow. She had heard his decree. Min-jae walked toward her, the weight of his authority shifting into the quiet strength of a man choosing a new path. He wasn't just abdicating a throne, he was choosing the light. He took Aisha's hand scarred, lethal, and beautiful, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a boss. He felt like a father. The golden afternoon sun of a Southern California spring draped the high school courtyard in a warm, amber glow. It was a day of white dresses, tossed caps, and the bittersweet air of endings and beginnings. Standing among the throng of proud parents, Hong Kong Min-jae leaned against a stone pillar, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of a light linen suit. The sharp edges of the man who had once ruled the underworld had softened, replaced by a deep, grounded serenity. Beside him, Aisha looked radiant, her dark skin glowing against a vibrant silk wrap, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. They watched as Kang Seo-yun walked across the stage, her posture graceful and her head held high. She was no longer the fragile little crane, who hid in the shadows of a fortress. She was a confident young woman with eyes that sparkled with ambition rather than fear. When she received her diploma, she didn't just smile for the camera. She caught Aisha's eye and performed a subtle, sharp tilt of her head, a silent acknowledgement of the wind dance that had once saved her life and built her spirit. "She has your eyes," Min-jae whispered, looking at Aisha with a devotion that had only deepened through the years of their quiet, legitimate life. And your fire. Aisha leaned her head against his shoulder. The silver scars on her wrists were still there, but they were no longer secrets to be hidden beneath lace cuffs. They were simply part of a story that had led her to this peace. She has her own fire now, Min-jae. We just made sure no one could blow it out. As the ceremony ended and Seo-yun came running toward them, her graduation gown fluttering like wings, Min-jae opened his arms to pull his family into a single, tight embrace. There were no guards and earpieces, no armored convoys waiting at the gates, and no shadows lurking in the corners of their minds. They were simply a father, a mother, and a daughter, standing in the light they had fought so hard to reach. The uniform of the warrior and the maid had long been discarded, leaving behind the only title that ever truly mattered, a family, finally and forever free.